10x your service design offering with Smaply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smaply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smaply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Dr. Josh Lepawsky is fascinated by connections between geography, technological systems, and their discards. He researches waste from the manufacturing of electronics to its end of life. He explores where e-waste accumulates and who it affects. He has a keen interest in how maintenance and repair might offer lessons for figuring out how to live well together in permanently polluted and always breaking worlds. I started our chat by asking Josh about the pernicious myth of digital as ethereal.
There's this long-standing tendency to think about and talk about and market the digital, broadly conceived here, to occur or happen in a placeless place. We use, at least in English, words like virtual often go with these kinds of technologies and how we talk about them, how we think about them, and that isn't an accident. It has been part of the conversation around the industries that design, make, build electronic devices really since their inception, and quite literally designed into the landscapes of the place that often now gets called Silicon Valley. Deliberately designed in, not as a kind of a whoopsie or a secondary consideration, but a primary consideration by the designers of those manufacturing landscapes to create something that would quite literally look like a clean industry and be different than what industry had meant sort of up to that point. And a lot of that design was about deliberately placing industrial infrastructure out of sight, literally putting it underground. Things like chemical storage tanks needed to, store the necessary chemicals for the manufacturing processes. And so it was a deliberate urban design process, and I think it has sort of been with us since at least the sort of 1950s and the urban design that emerged around folks at Stanford University's rolling out of the industrial infrastructure that became what today we know as Silicon Valley. But so why does it all matter? Well, I think one of the ways it matters is that it is very useful for the marketing and the industrial interests out of which digital technologies emerge, that they can trade on these images of being light green. I think of all of the metaphors that go with so much of the digital technologies we use, like the cloud, for example. I mean, it's hard to think of something more ethereal and fleeting as a cloud, and yet, as I'm sure you've spoken about on other episodes of the podcast, data centers and whatnot that we need for using digital technologies require huge amounts of energy, of course, just to run. Of course, they have to be built in the first place. They require huge amounts of water for cooling, energy for cooling, and so on and so forth. So this myth of the digital as ethereal, I think, is very useful in that it can be a way to divert attention from, in many ways, the very, sort of classic problems that come along with industrial production. That is, the use of energy and materials, and of course the wastes and pollution that pretty much always result.
To some degree, you could possibly argue that digital is the opposite of ethereal, that there's probably no industry that is more material intense and polluting gram for gram, pound for pound. If you look at the actual type of the variety and type of materials and their negative polluting potential consequences if they're not properly cared for and looked after.
Yeah, I mean, these kinds of sort of comparisons of different industrial sectors can, it can be really tricky to have commensurable measures, but there is good work in the early 2000s for sure by industrial engineers talking about, not just talking about, but demonstrating the energy and material footprints that are required for making digital devices. And I think there's a couple of points that are important to try and sort of disentangle here. And so one of them is that, digital devices do rely on some materials that are, let's say, different than other industrial products. The so-called 3TG, tin, tungsten, gold, these sorts of metals, rare earths and whatnot, that you don't necessarily find in other consumer products, though not exclusively. Gold is an obvious one. Copper is another obvious one that you would find in, say, traditional automobile manufacturing. But something that does set digital technologies apart in terms of their energy and material footprints for manufacturing is that to get the purity of materials that you need to make things like semiconductors so that they will work properly requires substantially more energy and material inputs in terms of purifying those materials enough that they can then be used to manufacture digital devices. So one analogy that I've recall from my reading in this area is that if you think about the purity of materials needed for manufacturing a silicon ingot, which is like a giant cylinder of, well, not, it's sort of a desk-sized cylinder of metal required for making the silicon that goes into semiconductor manufacturers. I don't know if you have this candy in Ireland, but Tic Tacs are a little candy that comes in a tiny little box. They're smaller. Each individual Tic Tac is smaller than your fingernail. And the analogy that I've seen in the literature in terms of the purity of silicon that you would need to line up those Tic Tacs from the west coast of the United States to the east coast, and only one Tic Tac in that line could be impure. That's the level of purity that it is required for making those semiconductors, and to get that kind of purity requires massive amounts of energy and intermediate inputs. So there are really, if you will, heavy consequences to manufacturing these devices.
Interesting, and I don't know whether it's connected, but I saw this study about that we are digging out of the earth in 2020 100 billion tons, and that roughly 90 billion tons of it is waste. But then when I did calculations on roughly the waste that I was seeing in the figures for electronics, it was more like 99.9%. To get the usable piece, it was 99.9% waste. Would that be roughly, in the, that to build a car or to build something else, it's 90% of the materials go to waste and 10% of them are usable. But to build the chip or the other things, it's a kind of 99.9% of the materials go to waste, and it's just that 0.1% that's usable.
Yeah, I mean, it's it does depend on where sort of in the life of a thing being built you look at it. But so in the mining sector, it is very normal for the mining sector. I mean, industry journals, industry representatives to talk about anywhere between 98 and 99% of a given mine's materials is considered waste, and they will use that term, waste or overburden. So those numbers that you're mentioning there are certainly within the realm of what would be considered very normal in the mining sector, regardless of whether it is about mining materials for electronics or other products. There's a couple of things I think can be said there. One is that for some materials, many metals, for example, they're mined and go into many different types of products, not just digital devices. Copper is a classic example, but there's certainly others. Aluminum is another classic example, and it can be very hard to kind of at the let's say at the mine site to disentangle how much of the ore coming out is going into this or that manufacturing sector down the line, as it were. But as I say, it's very normal in the mining world to talk about 98 to 99% of the material that is being moved around to be considered waste. So that very much accords with the numbers that you're talking about.
Why is it so important, this conversation that we're having now, that we're talking about manufacturing? It's probably not a subject that gets a lot of attention. I know, e-waste is getting getting a fair bit of attention, but often, we don't hear that much about the manufacturing angle. Why is it so important we really start thinking more about this manufacturing angle?
Yeah, so there's a few reasons. So one is in terms of just the sheer weight, the sheer level of harm, toxicity, etc. Most of the waste arising and most of the effects are being felt by people and places and ecologies that are, I'll use the term, upstream of where, say, you and I, as consumers of devices, purchase and use our digital technologies. So now, one of the reasons that so much attention is on consumer waste or e-waste that you and I, as users of devices, when we get rid of them, one of the reasons there's so much attention on that is because I think it seems very obvious to us that that's where the waste happens, because you and I have a tangible connection to it, right? We can see it, we can feel it, we can, if it's organic wastes from our households, we can smell it. We're putting it in this or that bin on a daily or weekly basis. We're taking, if there's curbside collection where we live, we're taking it outside. So we have this very visceral connection to that portion of the waste stream. But in terms of the overall waste stream, what you and I see, feel, smell, etc., is very tiny. On the order of 2 to 10% of overall waste arising. 90 to 98% of the waste arising from our electronics happened before you and I even purchased the devices that we're now using. But we don't typically have a direct connection to that. It's harder for us to see, unless, we happen to live or work in, say, a mine or near it, or we live and work near a manufacturing facility. We have a much less direct connection to that upstream waste, and yet, as I say, that's where most of the waste and pollution from electronics is happening. So it's important to sort of expand the frame, as you will, if you will, or turn our view upstream and come to grips with the magnitude of pollution and waste arising before we even purchase our devices, if we want to come up with ways of mitigating or eliminating the waste from electronics.
Perhaps this is part of what I might call the Larry Summers effect, or I came across this quote by him. He was a senior economist in the World Bank and part of the U.S. government, and this was back in 1991. And he said, just between you and me, this was an internal email in the just between you and me, shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the least developed countries? And that, there's a lot of thinking now that, the global north has essentially outsourced its pollution to the global south, which you kind of segues into your point about we've hidden the problem, so to speak, of the manufacture of our shiny new, devices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that has occurred in many ways. That quote from Larry Summers, and a related one, often comes up in the kind of pollution and waste research that I do. And I think while there is truth in it, it's also important to recognize that it is no longer just the global north that is that are users of these devices. That there's a great deal of what some people talk about as south-south trade, in terms of designing, building, consuming these devices. And I mean, so I'm not trying to minimize what if we look at a sort of from an industrial evolution sort of point of view, there has been a great deal of outsourcing or offshoring of industrial production to places outside the global north, and one of the consequences of that is the migration of pollution to those places. But we also, I think today, we live in a world where people around the world are using and consuming these devices, and it's just a little bit more complicated than putting the global north at the sort of the center of things and always the driver, as it were. Yeah.
True. No, that's a good point. Paint us a bit of a picture of, a town or a community. Probably it's going to be in the global south, even though, as you say, there's lots of south to south trade as well, that is living close to, say, a mine with a big, tailings or slag. The mine has been there for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. What's it going to be like there? And what are the danger? What's the overall picture of that community's life and health?
When the ore body is exposed to the atmosphere and to precipitation, you can get things like acid mine drainage from just plain old rainfall and the chemical reactions that occur as a consequence, and that acidified drainage can mobilize other chemicals that are naturally occurring in the ore body, and those can be quite toxic. And of course, you know, water flows where it will, so that can flow into other systems, agricultural systems, drinking water systems, and so on and so forth. So the effects can flow well beyond the mine site, even the adjacent community. The negative effects can flow quite far beyond the community in question. So it can be quite hard to sort of paint a generally applicable picture because of these sort of site-specific conditions that can make such a difference.
One of the things that does exist in a lot of environments would be these are kind of tailings lakes, or how big can they be, or what would they be more likely? You get a big tailings lake. Describe, or because I've only seen pictures of them I don't know if you've seen them up live, but they're things that we don't really know about. These big tailings lakes, they're not going to go away, are they? They're going to stay for thousands of years, and they're quite dangerous in the environment. And what sort of sizes could we be talking about?
Putting that sort of the magnitude in in perspective can be really hard. I mean, I have stood on the edge of a mine in Arizona, a copper mine in Arizona called the Copper Queen Mine, which is adjacent to a fairly small city called Bisbee, Arizona. The Copper Queen Mine in the late 19th, early 20th century, if I'm remembering my history correctly. It was one of the biggest mine sites at the time. And when you stand on, it's an open pit mine. When you stand on the lookout that is now right adjacent to the road that runs around its rim, I mean, it is an overwhelmingly vast hole in the ground. It's sort of, it's a reverse mountain, if that makes sense. It is it's almost it's hard to grasp the scale when you look across the rim and you can see buildings on the other side that the scale is so vast that it's hard to sort of determine visually how far away you are until you might see someone walking as this tiny dot on the other side of the rim.
Wow, it sounds like a meteorite strike.
It does. It's similar to that kind of thing. I mean, one of the interesting things about that specific one is that when you look at the site from an aerial photo or from a satellite photo, you can see the mine tailings that have been dug out of the ground and placed adjacent to the mine, and on which the town itself, Bisbee, Arizona, some parts of it are built on top of it. So the town is almost like the negative image of the hole in the ground. Yeah.
And for those who are not aware, or I suppose there's all sorts of types of tailings. Is essentially the waste of the mining process, and in some environments, the last thing you'd want to do is build a town on a tailing.
For sure. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, even in the case of Bisbee, Arizona, here we are in what is the most or second most wealthiest country in the world, the United States, and the town itself is still decades after the mine itself has closed, dealing with the local toxic consequences of that mining that went on for, let's say a century or so. 100 years or so before it, from opening to closing. So in terms of, and in very, sort of quotidian everyday ways, people not being able to, in their yards, being able to plant food gardens because of the toxins in the soil. The dust in the town is also a problem, because of the toxic chemicals that are just resident in the soil as a consequence of what gets called the overburden of the mine being, deposited at the surface. So the reason I mention this particular example is that the image is often, a an impoverished and racialized community in the global south that is strongly affected by these kinds of industrial sites. And of course is that happens, absolutely, but we don't have to go to the global south to find them. There are legacy sites in the global north and ones that are ongoing. You know,
One of the things you said earlier in this conversation about that certain minerals are more particular to electronics. Are there any minerals of these particular set that are more mining intensive or environmentally damaging that you could maybe describe a little, that have a bigger negative impact than, say, other sort of minerals minings, but that are essential for our smartphones or laptops?
it's actually hard to tie the degree of harm arising from mining to the particular materials involved. It has, I mean, not that there's no difference, but it has more to do with the mining practices involved, the magnitude of them, and how they're organized. So, um, yeah, I think that you can find um, e- extreme forms of harm, sort of no matter what the material, whether it's something as relatively mundane as, say, tin or aluminum being mined, or something like cobalt, tungsten, the more infamous rare earth metals. I think it has more to do with the mining practices that are the issues, the kinds of controls or lack thereof on things like tailings ponds, acid mine drainage, and whatnot. Um, and so again, not trying to diminish by any means the negative environmental consequences that occur from mining, but I think it would be, it's difficult to say that, say, copper is relatively okay relative to, I don't know, tantalum mining. It really matters on how the mining is done, more so than the materials, I would say.
And is there a how there, like you mentioned cobalt, that generally speaking, certain materials, because of where they're located, have poor mining practices, or is it just, a generalized thing there, or are there instances of more poor mining practices associated with certain materials because of where they're physically located?
Mining, and mining companies go where the ore is, and also where the ore is located at the, to be crass about it, at the cheapest possible price, right? Because their ultimate goal is to realize highest profit. That is what they do. And when you get a combination of all of those factors in a jurisdiction where there is either a lack of regulation on mining practices, or a lack of enforcement, or both, then you're more likely to have a higher degree of negative environmental and human consequences. And there's a lot of attention on the so-called informal sector, or sometimes it gets called artisanal mining, for example, in Congo, as it relates to things like tantalum, and which is an important material for electronics. But I think that attention needs to be nuanced enough to take into account the huge magnitude of what I would just describe as normal industrial mining, which far outweighs, in terms of negative consequences, what happens from the informal sector or the artisanal sector, especially in terms of just the vastly different power those two groups, if we can call them that, have. I mean, people working in the informal sector are living in conditions that are very different than, say, the CEOs of major mining companies. So,
Could you say, like I grew up on a farm, and if you a small farm, and if you do your farming properly, or if you change, you've potatoes in one field this year, and then you don't have them in the same, you let the field go fallow or whatever. But over time, if you do it right, you're not really, so to speak, damaging the land, or you certainly don't give the indicate. That you can farm sustainably in many ways. But is there such a thing as sustainable mining, or is all mining a kind of does damage? It's just a kind of the least damage, because when a mine leaves an area, or when it's mined out, it's it's not, most of those areas are going to really struggle to recover, aren't they? So,
well, certainly within human timescales, yes. Yeah. Is there such a thing as sustainable mining? I think that is, I think that is, the multi-billion-dollar question. I think the short answer is that industrial scale mining, as we know it now, is not sustainable. It is not something that that can go on indefinitely in the form that it currently takes. So what does that mean? It has major implications for how, and I have to sort of put it in air quotes here, how we, because who is that that benefits from those industrial mining practices? How we order and organize our lives. I think, this is very broad brushstroke and a bit abstract, but I think a key is figuring out how to learn to live with sufficiency. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. But I think, sort of in slightly more concrete terms, it means figuring out how to learn to live with substantially reduced material and energy throughput in the systems that we live in the global north, as it were. But even within that, there are really important distinctions to be made between different groups of people and how they are oriented in terms of economic class and associated ideas there.
just listening to you there, the conundrum or contradiction of renewables. And as you point out there, and as I thought, we don't have an energy production problem. We have an energy consumption problem. As you say, we consume far too much energy, but we are building. If we look at, e-cars or electric vehicles, for example, from what I've read, they are in their production, they are 4 to 5 times more materially intense, so mining dependent than our traditional vehicles. So if mining is not sustainable, and we're building this industry that we call sustainable or green on top of wholly unsustainable foundations, that's a kind of a problem, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely. Yes. No, it certainly is. I think, one of the ways that specific example that you're talking about there, electric vehicles, does to some degree dovetail with my work, because these cars are increasingly, I think it's relevant to think of them as sort of computers on wheels, rather than cars in the more traditional sense. So there is some overlap with my work here, and that isn't to say that I would, I think electric vehicles are a bad idea inherently. I wouldn't make that point, but they also are not going to solve the climate emergency for us. They, mining comes with harms that are not just related to carbon. There are toxic harms, other environmental harms, social harms, etc. So um, I think, thinking about electric vehicles as renewables, and the broader discourse of sort of what to call it, green consumerism, or green capitalism, if it is premised on continued growth, then it is inherently unsustainable. And that is an internal contradiction that um, those of us who care about such things need to sort out. Um, I think there are ways to do that, but it means, broad systemic changes.
Now, one slightly changing focus, a quote that from one of your articles I found really fascinating. I mean, all of it I found fascinating, but one was where you said, one of the best places for environmental chemists to look for previously unknown chemical pollutants is not in the environment or nature, but in the residues of previously manufactured commodities, particularly discarded electronics.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just explain that a bit? Because it sounds like
Sure.
an alien horror movie to some degree, or the plot of a new alien horror movie or something like that. In so maybe you could just expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, it's a counterintuitive kind of description, I know. But it's very concrete, very, as it were, down to earth. So it can be somewhat, I guess, amazing to learn that we have very little understanding of the sort of the galaxy of chemicals that all of our, sort of daily products that are surrounding us, and even in our homes that we live inside, are made of, which, might be surprising to listeners who might think, well, the industries must know the chemicals that are going into their, this or that product that they're making. And that is true, but only to a very small extent. So there are quite literally millions of different chemicals available for industrial uses, but only, sort of on the order of thousands have ever been tested for their toxicity. So there are differences by orders of magnitude between knowing the toxic consequences of this or that chemical and the number of chemicals that exist for industrial uses. So people who are experts in this area, people who would self-identify as environmental toxicologists, when in looking for new toxins of concern, there one publication in particular that I cite in my work makes this point very explicit, that they have found a previously unknown chemical toxicant not out in the environment, as it were, in sort of, some unexplored cave or something like that, but quite literally in the dust from electronics recycling facilities in Canada, or the household dust um, in homes that participated in the study, in Canada. So there, as I say, there are so many chemicals available for industrial use that it completely exceeds all of the testing capacity on Earth to keep up with the number of new chemicals being made available for industrial use. So there's literally no way to fully know the extent, if you will, of the chemical galaxy that we find ourselves increasingly living in.
And maybe this is an extreme comparison, but I had it in, I was thinking about it in over the last couple of weeks that we constantly worry, and rightly so, about nuclear power and nuclear waste, but we seem to have treated e-waste in an extremely lax way. Like, I mean, less than 20% of e-waste is properly recycled, and so the rest of it either goes to poor countries or whatever, and you can't throw this stuff away. There is no a way, like these forever chemicals and minerals and all the stuff. So that is e-waste, with all, and we're dumping 50 million tons and soon to be 100 million tons of e-waste every year. Is it, potentially we are a hidden time bomb that's full of nasty surprises for future generations?
In some sense, for sure. I think nuclear waste has a kind of spectacular imaginary that goes with it, in part because of the somewhat, spectacular accidents that have gone with it. Fukushima being one of the more recent ones, 3 Mile Island. These were very punctuated events and very mediagenic, which I think at least goes some way to explaining why we think of nuclear waste as somehow special. But I think you're exactly right. It's very important for us to understand that many of the everyday mundane objects around, or that are part of so many of our lives, everything from, a typical contemporary television to a phone to a computer, what have you, are made of materials that, from a geologic point of view, are effectively permanent. They will last long beyond anything recognizable as contemporary society, or perhaps even humans as a species. Plastics do not break down over timelines that are have any relationship to human lifetimes. Same with other materials that out of which our devices are manufactured. So in many ways, that kind of exotic or special sense that goes with something like nuclear waste is built right into many of the things that you and I, would handle in an everyday way. Even as we speak, the earphones around my head are made of plastics and metals that will last for millennia.
Yeah, and as you indicate, when they get dumped or they um, somebody uses a blowtorch on them, or acids, or even just rain, there can be chemical reactions or combinations, with those relatively currently innocuous, or iPhones, or laptops, that can create new combinations of harm as
That's right.
well. So so finally, summarize it. What can we do? Like,
Yeah.
so what can government, what can citizens, brands,
Yeah.
original manufacturers, mitigate? How can we mitigate, or how can we be better? I heard this great phrase that I think it was from some native person in some society, either the Maoris or something in New Zealand, about the need to be a good ancestor, and that I think most people would not want to leave a legacy for their children and grandchildren, and for the for the earth that is horrible and toxic and destructive. How, but we still want our phones, and we still want our, we don't want to, like, I grew up in a small farm, and we didn't even have a tractor, and that was no fun. Technology can give you, without technology, it's a back-breaking, hard, really, really, really hard and difficult life. So without us giving up all of these things, is there ways that, I was talking to a scientist there a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, the first Nokias had about 4 or 5 materials. Now they've got about 60 materials. I mean, can we still have good phones with less materials? Because if we've got, less materials, they're easier to disassemble and separate. Or what's the path forward? If growth is going to destroy, if there's no such thing as sustainable mining, but we need to do a bit of it, but what's the path forward?
Yeah. Well, I think I think the important thing is to think of as multiple paths, and they may or may not intertwine with one another, rather than a single, magic bullet. So maybe let's start with individuals as citizens and consumers, since I think that that's what is relevant to a lot of listeners, right? That's sort of the automatic, is like, what can I do? And I would say a couple of things. One is and it's, to be honest, which is, as an individual, there's very little that you can do. And I know that that can be a bit of a setback or a depressing thing, but if you think about it, going into an electronics store and you're going to buy a new phone or laptop or what have you, you have a pretty large array of choices around models and specifications and price ranges and whatnot. And so it would appear that you have a wide variety of choice. But when it comes to the underlying materials that all of those different models and makes and brands are made of, or the underlying labor conditions, they are so similar as to make the idea of consumer choice as a path forward to a more sustainable relationship with electronics basically meaningless. Because as I say, the underlying materials are so similar across those makes, models, brands, and the underlying labor conditions are so similar. So save yourself some time, and don't think that consumer choice is going to be a major way to mitigate. You can, the most environmental device you have is the one you already have, so you can keep using what you already have as long as possible. You can pass it along for reuse to friends, family, other organizations. But beyond those, there's not much that individual action can do. You can learn to repair. What does matter is organized consumer action, and that really means organized citizen action. And that might sound abstract, but so much of the way, at least in Western Europe and in Canada, the U.S., so much of our lives, without necessarily really thinking about it, are already ordered as a consequence of historical organized citizen action to have better conditions. For example, we in Canada or the U.S., you've got Health Canada, you've got the Food and Drug Administration. These are bodies that regulated things like pharmaceuticals, like food, that didn't just appear out of sort of uh, the altruism of lawmakers. It came out of organized consumer action in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And now, as a consequence of that, for the most part, there are high degrees of safety around food products that we consume and pharmaceuticals that we consume. That companies that make those products have to demonstrate in advance of them being put on the market that those products are safe within certain limits. Now that, and as I say, it wasn't always like that, and it didn't happen by itself. And also the examples that I just gave there, the FDA or Health Canada, I mean, there are caveats that come with it. They're certainly not perfect institutions by any means. But what those examples tell us is that those are multi-billion-dollar industries, food and pharmaceuticals, and we found ways to regulate them in ways that lead to a safer, not safe, but a safer material world. It tells us that if we can do it in those sectors, we can do it in other sectors. Another example is the automobile sector. Not all that long ago, things like automobile safety was completely voluntary and controlled by an industry consortium of an oligopoly, basically of 3 or 4 car manufacturers. But organized consumer action advocated for regulation that eventually became things like the National Transportation and Safety Administration in the United States. And as a consequence of regulations that came out of that, you cannot buy a car without, for example, working seatbelts. That wasn't always the case.
Maybe recent examples of that, are all the millions of young people, the Greta Thunberg movement, and of course the right to repair movement, which was absolutely not driven by government and was not and totally not driven by the brands. In fact, they tried to destroy it on multiple occasions. But it wasn't some huge organization. And yet right to repair resonated, because of citizen action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, speaking in broad brushstrokes, it's important to think of ourselves as citizens and to work together as citizens to affect change. And it's a cliche, but in many ways, that is how the biggest social shifts historically have happened. And it's that those historical shifts are sort of, I think, for a lot of us, so taken for granted, so in the background, in the sense of they are part of the infrastructure of daily life. For example, those relatively safe foods and pharmaceuticals, those relatively safe automobiles, that they're so mundane, they disappear from our sense that the world was ever any other way. And yet, as I say, those 3 economic sectors, automobiles, food, pharmaceuticals, all multi-billion-dollar sectors, all historically, and even now somewhat, controlled by a relatively small group of industrial interests. So very powerful, and yet they have been forced to change in certain ways how they manufacture the things that people as consumers bring into their daily lives.
Finishing off, say, let's say you're in your local community hall in your town, and people are saying there's 20 or 30 or 50 citizens, and they're there, and they're saying, Josh, we've read your stuff and we're listening. We really want to do something. We want to get together. We want to get organized. What is the seatbelt movement? What should we organize around? What should we start? Is there a seatbelt focus? That we could, start writing letters about to our politicians. What would you say is the first thing, that you'd say, well, we want to replace our battery? I don't know. Is there you got 50 enthusiastic citizens looking at you and saying, we want to do something. We want to get together and organize. What's our seatbelt movement focus? Is there, and maybe there just isn't one thing, but if you had to say to them, well, first focus on these couple of things.
Yeah, I would say focus on a couple of things. I mean, the first thing to do is to with that group would be to as clearly as possible define what it is you want to achieve, because you want to make sure that whatever action you're proposing matches up with the relationships that matter to the problem you want to solve. So if you want longer lasting devices, then maybe it's organizing around right to repair, for example. And even then, though, you need to pay attention to the specifics of where your community is located. So, for example, if I was, in this mythical town hall in Canada, I would have to grapple with the reality that Canada as a population is about the size of California. No major electronics manufacturer is going to make a Canadian phone that is, only that adheres to laws that we might get passed around, say, right to repair that are specific to Canada. So what does that mean? I need to look to the jurisdictions where right to repair is really taking off or is instituted, for example, like in the EU, and say agitate with my local politicians to say, look, you should pass regulations that match or exceed what's going on in this much bigger, much richer jurisdiction, for example, the EU, so that our devices are at least as long lasting. If that's one example. Another example, if your goal is a safer, like a chemically safer world around electronics, then again, I might look to what the European Union is doing with its REACH legislation. I forget what that acronym stands for just off the top of my head, but basically it regulates how chemicals are used and what chemicals can be used at all in any manufacturing of products that enter into the EU market. The reason that's so important is that it's upstream, right? It's in the sector, which is where the product design decisions are made that have the biggest consequences for what you personally as a citizen or a consumer will later go and purchase and use in your life.
If they were to say, well, Josh, what's your dream? I mean, if you have us, what would it be? The chemical focus? Would it be, what would you, if it was down to you to drive this community, what would you be writing your I know you're doing this in your career, but if you had to pick some, would it be those less chemicals in electronics, less material, a certain type of forever chemicals to try and reduce them or remove them, or, we've got these 50 people that are saying, we want to follow you. What's that one thing that you lead us towards what?
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, my focus would be on the chemical problems, and so this would be about sort of designing a campaign around, let's call it material simplicity for manufacturing. Perhaps putting, like the REACH legislation does in the EU, hard caps on certain kinds of chemicals being used at all. So there are, to the extent that I understand it, there are provisions within that legislation that, except in circumstances where there is no viable substitute for a given chemical, there are certain toxicants that are regulated out of use altogether. I think that is where I would focus my attention.
If you're interested in these sorts of ideas, please check out my book, Worldwide Waste, at gerrymcgovern.com. To hear other interesting podcasts, please visit thisishcd.com.